As opposed to deductive arguments, inductive arguments don't aim to prove their conclusion. Instead, inductive arguments aim to make the conclusion more likely or probable. In this module, we'll turn our attention to how we go about assessing inductive arguments using the concepts of strength and cogency. All right, let's move forward then and take on inductive arguments. So we've already mentioned the difference. And what's interesting is there's pretty much, we use different conceptual terms, okay? But what's interesting is you're still doing very similar things. So don't conflate these terms, okay? Don't make the rookie mistake of calling an inductive argument valid or invalid, or a deductive argument strong, okay? Don't conflate these, and it might be tempting because, again, what you're doing is very similar, okay? But what each of these concepts implies is different, okay? So an argument being valid is different than an argument being strong, okay? So again, make sure you're keeping these conceptual terms distinct. So we've already talked about, the difference, again, how we would identify the argument. Yes, we know there's an argument here. How we just tell if it's deductive versus inductive, okay? Inductive, we're lacking that thought that the conclusion was necessitated, okay? The person still thinks they're making a case for why this is probably going to be true or more likely to be true, right, given these premises or the reasons. But they don't think it has to be the case. Okay, everybody's good there? Okay, so then when it comes to analyzing the inductive arguments, we're doing something very similar. Okay, first we're going to assess the reasoning. So just like in deductive arguments, with inductive arguments, this first step, you don't care whether the premises really are true. You assume they're true, and you say, if I assume these true, not does this have to be true, like deductive, like validity, right? If I assume these true, is this a lot more likely to be true, right? Does it enhance or increase the likelihood of this being true? And it's kind of a spectrum, right? You can give different arguments for the same conclusion, which would be relatively stronger or weaker than other arguments for that same conclusion. So unlike the validity, where it's like on, off, valid, invalid, right? There's more of a spectrum here, okay? But we're just going to use it. So if an argument, we're going to say an inductive argument is strong, right? When you assume the premises are true and the conclusion is a lot more likely to be true, okay? You would say it's strong. Whereas if you could assume the premises are true and the conclusion, there's not much reason to think it's any more likely still to be true, even granting these are true, then you would say it's weak, okay? So you're assessing, if I assume these are true, the likelihood, like how much does that increase the likelihood that this is going to be true? If it doesn't really increase it at all, you would say it's a weak inductive argument. If it increases the likelihood of this significantly, you would call it strong. Okay. Does that make sense? So we don't care, just like validity and deductive arguments, we don't care whether the premises are actually true yet. Okay. Assuming they're true, to what degree do they increase the probability or likelihood of the conclusion being true? Okay. A lot, well then call it strong. Not much, if any, then call it weak. Okay. And then any guesses in terms of cogency? Same thing, except here, same thing as soundness for deductive arguments, except here, right, we're dealing with inductive arguments, so it has to be strong, and then it has that same second requirement. So in order to label an inductive argument cogent, okay, it would have to be strong. So assuming these premises are true, the conclusion is a lot more likely to be true, okay? And all the premises are true. Now notice, even when you have a really strong, good inductive argument, there's still not that necessity the conclusion is going to be true, right? There's still the possibility, even in the best case inductive argument, right, that the conclusion could turn out false, okay? But anyway, going back to a cogent inductive argument, what we're saying is it's strong. Assuming these premises are true, the conclusion is a lot more likely to be true. And we're saying all the premises are true. Okay. Questions, comments, concerns? It's all crystal clear, at least for now. Okay, quick example. Most people now notice that indicator word, most. Okay. Switch that to all. This would get a lot more interesting in terms of figuring out whether it's deductive or inductive or how we should take it. Now there is probably in the conclusion, probably is usually inductive, right? Whereas must is usually deductive, right? Notice the difference between probably and must. Okay, anyway, so we have words in the premise and the conclusion that are signaling that this is likely inductive. Okay? given how it's couched or the words used. So anyway, premise 1, most people named Brad have over $17 million. Premise 2, your instructor's name is Brad. Conclusion, your instructor probably has over $17 million. Is this argument strong? I got one no, one naysayer. I have a lot of naysayers, okay. See, I think you guys are tempted by the rookie, all right? You're making that rookie mistake where the premises seem so ludicrous, or at least one of them, right, that it feels weird to call this a strong argument. But, again, what are we asking when we ask if it's strong? If I assume the premises are true, not are the premises true, if I assume the premises are true, is the conclusion a lot more likely? Now let's ask this again. What do you guys think? It is strong, right? Again, regardless, unfortunately, premise 1 in my experience is not true, right? So, but it doesn't matter, right, when it comes to the strength. Assuming they're true, yes, that conclusion is a lot more likely to be the case. Does everybody see that? Okay, so this is a good example, right, of the tendency or susceptibility of rookies sometimes. I mean, because this is that premise 1, right, pretty funky. But this is still a strong argument, okay? So hopefully you guys can see that now. Okay, now what's the issue, though? Pretty sure premise 2 is true, right? But what about premise 1? Not true, at least in my experience. So while strong, it's not cogent, okay, because one or more of the premises are false. So remember, all it takes is one to be false, and the whole thing is, in an inductive argument, not cogent, or if it's deductive, right, the whole thing's unsound if one of the premises is false. Questions, comments, concerns? So again, this is all brand new to you. I know it's like completely foreign, but hopefully it's starting to settle in and make some sense here. Okay. Inductive arguments come in a lot of different varieties. Now that we've become acquainted with how to assess inductive arguments using strength and cogency, we'll turn our attention to one of the more common types of inductive arguments that you'll encounter, the argument by analogy.